Henry Zeffman, BBC chief political correspondent. Well, let's speak to Annunziata Rees-Mogg, a journalist and former member of the European Parliament for the Brexit Party and later for the Conservatives, and Sir Nick Harvey, a former Liberal Democrat Armed Forces Minister, now CEO of the European Movement, which is a group that works for closer ties with the EU. Annunziata Rees-Mogg, let's begin with you. What do you make of all those details that Henry's just been telling us?
I think Henry put one thing exceptionally well, that the freedom of movement proposals, whether renamed to make it more palatable to the British public as youth experience or not, is a big concession from the British government. But so is fishing. Giving away one of our biggest bargaining chips for 12 years, not being able to revisit and renegotiate, is a huge concession to the EU. And the question is, do we get anything in return? The EU is already in contravention of international law for not having mutual recognition of food standards that they already do with New Zealand, for example, and they should with us because our food is of the same quality. But if we go into dynamic alignment with them, which is what they want, they get to set all the rules, and our farmers and our food producers have no choice but to follow and don't have any place at the table. Even if they did, it would be a small voice, but there will be none at all. We will just have to follow what they do, which in turn puts our trade deals with the rest of the world at risk.
So you've got a range of concerns. Sir Nick Harvey, I wonder what you say in response to that.
Well, I think this is a very good set of agreements. From what we can tell, I think the negotiation of the Brexit deal was a complete botch-up. For all that we heard from Boris Johnson that it was an oven-ready deal, the fact of the matter is it was half-baked, and this is putting right some of the more egregious flaws in that faulty process from 2020.
But do you think the government is getting enough in return for signing that 12-year fishing deal, which gives EU boats access to British waters on the terms of the deal as it's set out?
Well, this is the same fishing deal that the Conservatives negotiated in 2020 for 5 years. It's being extended for another 12. It's not exactly what the British fishing industry wants, I accept that, but in return we're getting access for the rest of our agricultural produce on much easier terms into Europe, and overall that's a really good deal. And although the fishermen might not like it, actually 12 years certainty, knowing where they are, knowing what investment decisions they can and should take, they may not like it, but it's probably better for them than this thing permanently coming back around and around and around.
And Annunziata Rees-Mogg, on the point that Sir Nick Harvey is making about the Brexit deal, do you accept, and some Brexiteers certainly do, that even if you were keen on the broader idea of Brexit, the form it took in the deal that was signed is not serving the UK as well as it might?
It was for the length of time it was, so it could be renegotiated and we continued having a stake in the game. I mean, of course, this is a very good deal, as Nick just said, if you want us to rejoin the EU by the back door. But it is handing over powers and taking nothing back in return.
But what about the question they asked, though, which is that Brexit in the form that it took with the deal that Boris Johnson signed has not even pleased a number of high-profile Brexiteers?
It was not perfect, and it was a short-term agreement for that very reason, that as we make deals with other countries, different things become important. There's innovation, there's technology, there's change, and change of British requirements. Handing things over on the long term is a huge mistake. We should be making sure that we retain the sovereignty we fought so hard to get, and that 17.4 million people voted for.
And on that point, Sir Nick Harvey, is there a risk that cutting a deal like this undermines democracy, sends a message that, well, the majority of people may have voted for Brexit, but actually now a few years have passed, we're going to start watering down exactly what that means?
Well, look, our food standards are pretty similar to Europe's anyway, simply because we were in there for 40 years and helped make all of those standards. If going forward we're saying that we're going to have to keep up with their standards, well, we would anyway, because if British farmers want to sell our agricultural produce into Europe, we have no choice but to follow
one of the points of Brexit
rules.
Was that the UK could set its own regulations,
yes,
didn't have to take Brussels lead.
Indeed, but why on earth would we? It's no use to anyone to have a separate set of regulations. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, the pharmaceutical industry, the car industry. They don't have two production lines, one to British standards, one to European standards. They'll all have to work to European standards anyway. We became rule takers the day we chose to cease being rule makers.
What about that point, Annunziata Rees-Mogg, that inevitably when you've got a market the size of the European Union on our doorstep, you are going to have to follow their regulations, because in the end a lot of businesses will want to sell their products into that market?
We import far, far more than we export in food terms to the EU. I mean, this is rather inevitable given their size and our size. We do export to the rest of the world. But making sure that our farmers have to follow rules over which we have no say. We have already diverged since 2020 in certain areas, such as having pesticide effective GM crops and being able to grow different types of crops that the EU doesn't currently allow. Now, if we only take their rules, our farmers will only be able to, will have to follow that and not have the ability to innovate and make sure we can have food security here and cheaper food. That if one of the newspapers today had a headline saying we'll get cheaper beef, well, if we look across to the EU, if you take France, its beef is 50% more expensive than ours already. This is just untrue.
You are clearly unimpressed by today's developments. I just wonder, because we're about to speak to some of our listeners, do you think this is a betrayal?
As far as we've got so far, and more details are coming out, everything we've seen has been a complete betrayal. And I think Labour misled the electorate by Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Cooper, all saying that we would not go back into the single market. Dynamic alignment is, and there'd be no freedom of movement when there's huge youth unemployment in the EU, and of course they want to come here and take British jobs.
So you feel misled. So Nick Harvey, how do you feel as Henry Zeffman and other reporters give us the details of what's coming?
I think this is a significant but fairly modest step forward. I don't think there's any evidence that British voters are opposed to a youth mobility scheme. Quite the opposite. I don't think there's any evidence that British food consumers want to have lower standards than the rest of Europe. I don't think Keir Starmer's taking a massive risk. I think he's got the public with him on this.
Both of you, thank you very much indeed. That's Sir Nick Harvey from the European Movement, which is a group working for closer ties with the EU. And we also heard from Annunziata Rees-Mogg, who's a journalist. You've got it.